Sometimes the most broken things in life teach us the greatest lessons about hope. In a dusty auction yard, a sick horse stood alone while buyers walked away shaking their heads. The animal was thin, weak, and clearly dying. Nobody wanted to waste their money on something so worthless. But then a blind cowboy named Thomas Mackenzie stepped forward. At 67, he'd lost his sight in a ranch accident years ago. His hands found the horse's trembling neck. He couldn't see what everyone else saw, but he felt something different. Thomas whispered quietly to the animal, and something magical happened between two broken souls. The other ranchers thought he was crazy for buying a dying horse. But what they didn't understand was that sometimes the most damaged things just need someone to believe in them. What happened next between this blind man and sick horse would prove that healing comes in the most unexpected ways. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The old leather saddle hung in the corner of the barn like a monument to better days. Thomas Mackenzie ran his weathered fingers along its worn edges, feeling every crack and crease that told the story of a life lived hard and proud. The silver buckles had tarnished, and the leather had darkened with age, but it still held the scent of glory days when Thomas was the name whispered with respect at every rodeo from Montana to Texas. 5 years had passed since the accident that stole his sight, but Thomas could still remember every detail of that championship saddle. He'd won it at the Calgary Stampede in 1978, riding a bronc called Devil's Dance that had thrown 17 men before Thomas climbed on. 8 seconds later, he was champion, and Sarah was crying happy tears in the stands, her voice cutting through the roar of 20,000 people. Sarah. Even now, 3 years after her passing, Thomas could hear her laugh echoing in the empty spaces of their ranch house. She'd been the one to help him navigate those first dark months after the accident, teaching him to trust his other senses, to find his way around their home with patience and love. When the cancer took her, it felt like losing his sight all over again, only worse this time. The Mackenzie Ranch had seen better days, too. What once was a thriving operation with over 200 head of cattle now barely supported a dozen aging steers. The fences needed mending, the barn roof leaked when it rained, and the feed bills kept climbing while the bank account kept shrinking. Thomas knew the neighbors whispered about him, wondering how long a blind man could keep a ranch running, wondering when he'd finally admit defeat and sell to Jake Morrison, who'd been circling like a vulture with cash offers every few months. "Morning, Thomas." Doc Henderson's voice carried across the yard, followed by the sound of his truck door slamming shut. The veterinarian had been making these visits more frequently lately. Not for any animals, Thomas had so few left, but to check on his old friend. "Coffee's fresh," Thomas called back, already heading toward the house. His walking stick tapped against the familiar stones of the pathway, each one placed exactly where Sarah had positioned them years ago to guide his steps. Doc Henderson was a good man, one of the few who still treated Thomas like he had something to offer the world. At 72, the vet had delivered more calves and mended more broken bones than anyone in 3 counties, and his weathered hands still held steady when an animal needed help. "You're thinking too hard again," Doc said, settling into the kitchen chair that creaked just the way it had for the past 20 years. "I can practically hear the gears grinding from here." Thomas poured 2 cups of coffee, the routine so familiar he could do it in his sleep. The kitchen smelled like bacon grease and old wood, like memories of Sarah's cooking and lazy Sunday mornings when the future stretched out bright and endless. "Jake Morrison stopped by yesterday," Thomas said, taking his seat across from his friend. "Upped his offer again. And I'm running out of reasons to say no." Thomas lifted the cup to his lips, savoring the bitter warmth. "Ranch is falling apart, Doc. I can feel it in every board, every post, every blade of grass. Place needs more than I can give it." Doc Henderson was quiet for a long moment, and Thomas could picture him stroking his grey beard the way he always did when he was thinking. "You know, there's an auction this Saturday, Old Miller Place. They're selling off everything before the bank takes it. Thomas had heard about the Miller place, good people who'd gotten caught in the same squeeze that was choking half the ranchers in the valley. Bad weather, falling prices, and loans that came due, whether the cattle sold or not. Might be some good deals on equipment, Doc continued. Tools, maybe a tractor if you're interested. Thomas shook his head. Can't afford equipment, Doc. Hell, I can barely afford the coffee we're drinking. Maybe not equipment then, but sometimes a man finds what he needs instead of what he's looking for. There was something in Doc's tone that made Thomas pause. His friend had a way of saying things that meant more than the words themselves, like he was planting seeds for thoughts that would grow later. After Doc left, Thomas walked the property with his stick and his memory, following the fence line he'd walked 10,000 times before. He could feel the weight of the place settling on his shoulders like an old coat, comfortable but heavy. Sarah used to walk these same paths with him in the evenings, her hand tucked into his arm, both of them planning improvements they'd make come spring, talking about the children they'd never had but somehow never stopped hoping for. The silence out here was different from the silence in town. In town, silence felt like judgment, like people holding their breath, waiting for him to fail. Out here, silence felt like possibility, like the land itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Saturday morning came grey and cold, with the kind of wind that cut through a man's jacket and reminded him winter was never far away in Montana. Thomas almost stayed home. The idea of standing around while people picked through the remains of another man's dreams felt too much like looking into his own future. But something pulled him toward town anyway. Maybe it was Doc's words about finding what you need instead of what you're looking for. Maybe it was the loneliness that had been creeping up on him like fog, making even his own company feel thin and insufficient. The auction yard buzzed with familiar voice ranchers and dealers, neighbors and strangers, all gathered to divide up what remained of the Miller legacy. Thomas recognized most of the voices, could place them to faces he remembered from before the accident. They nodded politely when they saw him, but he could feel their discomfort, their uncertainty about how to talk to a man who couldn't see their expressions. The auctioneer's voice carried across the yard, calling out lot numbers and starting bids. Tools went for reasonable prices, equipment sold to the highest bidder, and slowly the Miller place was parceled out to people who would use the pieces to build their own dreams. Then the livestock came up for sale. Thomas heard the sounds of horses being led into the ring, their hooves shuffling against the packed earth, the murmur of the crowd as they evaluated each animal. Most sold quickly to buyers who knew what they were looking for. Then came a silence that felt different. It stretched too long, filled with the kind of uncomfortable quiet that comes when something unpleasant enters a room. Lot 47, the auctioneer announced, his voice losing some of its enthusiasm. Gelding, age unknown, as is, where is. Thomas heard the collective intake of breath, the shuffle of feet as people stepped back rather than forward. Whatever they were looking at, it wasn't good. He moved closer to the fence, his stick guiding him through the crowd, until he could smell the distinctive scent of horse and hay and something else, something that spoke of sickness and neglect. "Do I hear 50?" the auctioneer called out. No response. 25? Still nothing. How about $10? The silence stretched so long it became painful. Thomas could feel the weight of it, the awkwardness of a room full of people looking at something nobody wanted. His fingers found the fence rail, and he leaned forward, letting his other senses paint the picture his eyes couldn't see. The sound that broke the silence wasn't what anyone expected. It came from Thomas Mackenzie's walking stick tapping against the fence rail, a steady rhythm that seemed to say he was thinking, measuring, considering something the rest of them had already dismissed. $50, Thomas called out, his voice cutting through the uncomfortable quiet like a blade through butter. The murmur that followed rippled through the crowd like water disturbed by a stone. Thomas heard the shuffle of boots, the whispered conversations that people thought he couldn't hear. Words like crazy and blind fool and waste of good money drifted to his ears, but he'd learned long ago to let such talk roll off his back like rain off a tin roof. "Sold to the gentleman with the walking stick," the auctioneer announced, relief evident in his voice. He was probably grateful to move on to the next lot, something that wouldn't make everyone so uncomfortable. Thomas made his way toward the payment table, his stick navigating around legs and boots and the detritus of the auction. Behind him, he could hear people already moving on, their attention shifting to more promising lots. Nobody lingered to see what the blind cowboy had just bought himself. "You sure about this, Thomas?" The voice belonged to Bill Preston, a neighbor who'd known Thomas since before Sarah, before the accident, before everything changed. Bill's tone held the careful concern of a man trying to talk sense into a friend without causing offense. "I'm sure," Thomas replied, pulling out his worn wallet. $50 wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it represented groceries for a week, or gas for the truck, or any number of necessities that his shrinking budget demanded careful consideration for. After the paperwork was completed, Thomas followed the sound of hooves to where they'd led his purchase. The smell hit him first, the sour scent of illness, the underlying musk of an animal that hadn't been properly cared for in too long. Then came the sound of labored breathing, each exhale a soft wheeze that spoke of congested lungs and tired bones. "He's in rough shape, Mr. Mackenzie." The voice belonged to one of the auction hands, a young man whose boots scuffed nervously in the dirt. "Real rough shape. You might want to reconsider." Thomas extended his hand slowly, the way Sarah had taught him to approach any frightened animal. His fingers found the lead rope first, then followed it up to where it connected to a halter that felt loose and frayed with age. The horse didn't pull away, which told Thomas something important. This animal was either too sick to fight or too defeated to care. His hands continued their exploration, reading the horse's condition through touch, the way a blind man learns to read the world. The neck was thin, the muscles wasted from poor nutrition. The coat felt rough and patchy, missing in places where illness or neglect had taken its toll. When his palm pressed against the animal's side, he could feel each rib distinctly, like fence posts under a thin blanket. But there was something else there, too, something the sighted people in the crowd might have missed while they were focusing on the obvious problems. When Thomas's hand rested on the horse's neck, just behind the ears, he felt a slight lean into the touch. The animal's breathing, while labored, seemed to calm a fraction at human contact. "What's his story?" Thomas asked the auction hand. "Came in with the Miller estate. Been in the back pasture for months, maybe longer. Old man Miller was too proud to ask for help when things got bad, and I guess this one got forgotten about. Probably should have been put down months ago, if you ask me." Thomas continued his examination, his hands telling him things that eyes might miss. The horse's legs felt sound, despite everything else, the hooves solid if overgrown. There was structure under the neglect, bones that suggested this had once been a substantial animal. Age was hard to determine through touch alone, but the horse didn't feel ancient, just worn down by circumstances. "Help me get him loaded," Thomas said, surprising the young man. Loading the horse into Thomas's trailer took patience and gentle coaxing. The animal moved slowly, each step deliberate and careful, but he followed Thomas's voice and the gentle pressure of the lead rope. Once inside, he stood quietly, too tired to be nervous about the confinement. The drive home gave Thomas time to think about what he'd just done. $50 might not seem like much to most people, but for a man living on a fixed income with a failing ranch, it represented a leap of faith he couldn't entirely explain. Sarah would have understood. She'd always been the one to bring home stray singered cats, orphaned calves, anything that needed help and had nowhere else to go. Maybe that was what he'd recognized in that auction yard silence, the feeling of being something nobody wanted, something people looked at and saw only the problems, only the cost, only the inconvenience. He'd been living with that feeling for 5 years now, ever since the accident took his sight and left him fumbling around in a world that seemed designed for people who could see. When they reached the ranch, Thomas took his time unloading his purchase. The horse stepped down from the trailer with the same careful deliberation he'd shown loading up, and Thomas led him toward the small corral behind the barn, where he could keep him separate from the other animals, until he figured out what kind of condition they were really dealing with. "Well, old boy," Thomas said, removing the frayed halter and replacing it with one of his own that fit better. "I guess we're stuck with each other now." The horse stood in the center of the corral, not moving toward the water trough or the hay Thomas had thrown over the fence. Just standing, like he wasn't quite sure what was expected of him now that someone had claimed him. Thomas leaned against the fence rail, listening to the animal's breathing, trying to piece together a plan from the fragments of knowledge he'd accumulated over 40 years of ranch life. The horse needed food, obviously, but not too much too fast or it could kill him. He needed veterinary attention, which would cost money Thomas didn't have. He needed time and patience, and the kind of care that couldn't be rushed. What he needed, Thomas realized, was exactly what Thomas himself had needed after the accident, someone willing to believe that broken didn't mean worthless, that damaged didn't mean beyond repair. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades Thomas could only remember, he stood by the corral and listened to his new companion's quiet breathing. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the wind rustled through the cottonwoods Sarah had planted along the creek. "I don't know what I'm doing," Thomas admitted to the horse, his voice carrying across the corral in the gathering dusk. "But I figure we'll figure it out together." The horse didn't respond, but Thomas thought he heard a slight change in the breathing, a settling that might have been the beginning of trust. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And sometimes, Thomas had learned, a start was all you needed to find your way through the darkness. The wooden medicine cabinet sat on the workbench in the barn, like a shrine to gentler times. Thomas's fingers traced the familiar edges, feeling for the small brass latch that Sarah had polished to a warm glow every spring. Inside, her collection of remedies waited in their glass jars and tin container sherbs she'd grown in her garden, salves she'd mixed by hand, treatments passed down from her grandmother, who doctored animals when real veterinarians were 100 miles away. Thomas had avoided opening the cabinet since Sarah's death. It felt too much like disturbing her memory, like admitting she was really gone. But now, with a sick horse depending on him and veterinary bills he couldn't afford, her knowledge felt like the only lifeline he had. The first jar his fingers found contained dried comfrey leaves, their papery texture still intact after 3 years. Sarah had sworn by comfrey for healing wounds and reducing inflammation. Next to it sat a container of honey that had crystallized but was still good, and beyond that, a small bottle of apple cider vinegar that she'd used for everything from digestive problems to hoof rot. "Start with what you know," he could hear her saying, her voice as clear in his memory as if she were standing beside him. "Animals are simpler than people think. They need food, water, shelter, and someone who cares enough to pay attention." Thomas carried the medicine cabinet to the corral, where his nameless horse stood in the same spot as the night before. The animal's breathing sounded marginally better in the morning air, but Thomas could still hear the congestion that spoke of respiratory problems. "Morning, old boy," Thomas said softly, approaching the fence with the same slow movements he'd used at the auction. "Thought we might start working on getting you feeling better." The horse's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, which Thomas took as a good sign. Animals that had given up completely stopped responding to human interaction altogether. This one was still listening, still aware of the world around him. Thomas mixed a handful of grain with some honey and a pinch of the dried herbs, creating a mixture that smelled like Sarah's kitchen on Sunday mornings. He'd watched her do this same thing for countless sick animals over the years, always starting with small amounts, always building trust before trying to heal. He climbed over the fence, moving slowly enough that the horse could track his movements by sound. When he held out the grain mixture in his cupped palm, the horse approached with tentative steps, nostrils flaring as he investigated the offering. The first touch of whiskers against Thomas's palm brought back a flood of memories. Sarah standing beside him in this same corral, laughing as a young colt licked grain from her hands. Her voice explaining that trust between human and animal always started with the simple act of sharing food, of proving that human hands brought comfort instead of harm. The horse ate slowly, carefully, like he wasn't quite sure this wasn't some kind of trick. Thomas could feel the soft muzzle exploring his palm, searching for every grain, and gradually the animal's head lowered until his breath was warming Thomas's hands. "That's it," Thomas murmured, the way Sarah had taught him to talk to frightened animals. "Easy does it. Nobody's going to hurt you here." Over the next hour, Thomas established a routine that would become their morning ritual. Fresh water in a clean bucket, a careful ration of grain mixed with Sarah's healing herbs, and a thorough hands-on examination that allowed him to monitor the horse's condition without the expense of constant veterinary visits. The horse's ribs were still clearly visible, but Thomas thought he detected a slight improvement in muscle tone. The coat remained rough and patchy, but it felt less brittle under his touch. Most importantly, the animal's responses seemed a little more alert, a little more engaged with the world around him. "Need to give you a name," Thomas said, running his hands along the horse's neck. "Can't keep calling you old boy forever." The horse stood quietly under Thomas's ministrations, occasionally leaning into the contact like he was starved for gentle touch. There was something about the animal's patient endurance that reminded Thomas of his own journey through the dark months after his accident, the way you learned to accept help even when pride wanted you to refuse it, the way you discovered that healing happened one small step at a time. "Spirit," Thomas said suddenly, the name feeling right as soon as he spoke it. "That's what we'll call you, because you're not giving up, are you, boy? Still got some fight left in you." As if responding to his new name, Spirit raised his head and took a step closer to Thomas, close enough that the man could feel the horse's warmth against his chest. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental, the first voluntary sign of trust from an animal that had every reason to fear human contact. The rest of the morning passed in a rhythm that felt natural despite being new. Thomas cleaned Spirit's water bucket and refilled it from the well, taking care to test the temperature with his hand, the way Sarah had taught him. He spread fresh hay in the shelter she'd built for sick animals, creating a soft bed that would encourage Spirit to lie down and rest. When Doc Henderson's truck pulled into the yard around noon, Thomas was sitting on the fence rail, listening to Spirit's breathing and feeling cautiously optimistic about the small improvements he'd detected. "Heard you made quite a purchase at the auction," Doc said, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the corral. "Word travels fast in a small town," Thomas replied. "Fast enough. Mind if I take a look at what you bought yourself?" Thomas climbed down from the fence and opened the gate, allowing Doc to enter the corral. He listened as the veterinarian's experienced hands performed their own examination, checking the things Thomas couldn't assess through touch alone: the color of the horse's gums, the clarity of his eyes, the specific nature of his respiratory distress. "Well," Doc said finally, "he's in rough shape, but I've seen worse animals make full recoveries. Respiratory infection, probably pneumonia, severe malnutrition, obviously. Some skin conditions that are more cosmetic than serious. The good news is his basic structure is sound. This was once a well-built animal." "What's the bad news?" "Treatment's going to be expensive. Antibiotics, nutritional supplements, probably a few follow-up visits. We're looking at several $100s minimum." Thomas felt the familiar weight of financial reality settling on his shoulders. Several $100s might as well have been several thousand for all the difference it made to his bank account. "Doc," he began, but the older man held up a hand. "Hold on now. Let me finish." Doc's voice carried the tone of a man who'd already made up his mind about something. "I've been thinking about retiring, you know. Getting too old to be crawling around barns in the middle of the night. Been looking for someone to help me clear out my medicine supplies." Thomas waited, not sure where this was heading. "Happens I've got a whole cabinet full of antibiotics that are getting close to their expiration dates. Hate to see them go to waste. And I've been meaning to check on you anyway. Make sure you're taking care of yourself out here. Might as well kill two birds with one stone." The kindness in Doc's offer was wrapped in enough practical reasoning to let Thomas accept it without feeling like charity. It was the kind of gesture that small communities were built on: people helping people because that's what neighbors did, dressed up as mutual convenience to preserve everyone's dignity. "I'd appreciate that, Doc," Thomas said quietly. As the veterinarian prepared the first injection, Thomas held Spirit's head, whispering the same soothing words Sarah had used with frightened animals. The horse flinched at the needle's sting but didn't fight, as if he understood that this discomfort was somehow different from the pain he'd been carrying. After Doc left, Thomas returned to the corral, where Spirit stood in his favorite spot near the water trough. The afternoon sun felt warm on Thomas's face, and he could hear the sounds of his small ranch coming to life around him, birds in the cottonwoods, cattle lowing in the distance, the familiar creak of the windmill that needed oil, but still pumped water faithfully. For the first time in months, maybe years, Thomas felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. It was fragile and tentative, built on nothing more than a sick horse's willingness to eat grain from his hand and a good friend's generous heart. But it was there, warm and persistent, as the Montana sun on his face. "What do you think, Spirit?" he asked the horse. "Think we might just surprise everybody?" The old feed bucket had seen better days. Its metal sides were dented from years of use, and the bottom showed the scars of countless meals shared between human and animal. But when Thomas heard Spirit's hooves moving toward it for the third morning in a row, that battered bucket became the most beautiful sound in the world. It meant hope. It meant healing. It meant that sometimes broken things could find their way back to wholeness if someone cared enough to believe in them. Thomas stood by the fence, listening to the gentle sounds of Spirit, eating the soft crunch of grain, the occasional snuffle of satisfaction, the steady rhythm of an animal that was learning to trust again. 2 weeks had passed since the auction, and the changes were becoming impossible to ignore. The wheezing in Spirit's breathing had diminished to an occasional cough. The antibiotics Doc Henderson had provided were working their quiet miracle, and Thomas could hear the difference in every breath. More importantly, Spirit's appetite had improved dramatically. What had started as tentative nibbling had become genuine enthusiasm for his morning and evening meals. Thomas had developed a routine that revolved around these twice-daily feedings, and Spirit had learned to anticipate them. The horse would move to the fence line when he heard Thomas's boots on the gravel, nickering softly in greeting. It was a sound that never failed to warm Thomas's heart, proof that Spirit was rediscovering his voice along with his health. "Morning, boy," Thomas said, climbing over the fence with the feed bucket balanced carefully in one hand. "How are we feeling today?" Spirit approached without hesitation now, his muzzle finding Thomas's shoulder in a gesture that had become their morning greeting. The horse's coat felt different under Thomas's hand, still rough in places, but with an underlying vitality that hadn't been there before. New hair was growing in the bare patches, and the skin beneath felt healthier, less dry and flaky. But the most remarkable change was in Spirit's behavior. The defeated, listless animal from the auction yard had been replaced by a horse that showed genuine interest in his surroundings. Thomas could hear him moving around the corral at night, no longer content to stand in one spot, waiting for whatever came next. "Doc Henderson's coming by this morning," Thomas told Spirit as the horse worked through his breakfast. "Wants to see how you're doing with those antibiotics." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Doc's pickup truck rumbled into the yard just as Thomas was finishing his morning examination of Spirit's legs and hooves. The veterinarian's routine visits had become as regular as clockwork, officially to monitor Spirit's progress, but really to check on both of his patients. "Well, I'll be damned," Doc said, studying Spirit from outside the corral. "Thomas, that horse looks like a completely different animal." "Feels different too," Thomas replied, running his hand along Spirit's neck. "Stronger, more alert. Yesterday I heard him whinny at the cattle in the next pasture. First time he's shown any interest in the other animals." Doc entered the corral and performed his examination with the thoroughness of a man who'd spent 50 years reading the subtle signs of animal health. Thomas listened to the quiet sounds of the checkup, the stethoscope against Spirit's chest, the gentle manipulation of joints and muscles, the satisfied grunts that indicated Doc's approval of what he was finding. "Respiratory infections cleared up completely," Doc announced. "Muscle tone's improving, coat's coming back nicely. I'd say we're looking at a genuine recovery here." The words sent a surge of satisfaction through Thomas that surprised him with its intensity. When was the last time he'd felt truly successful at something? When was the last time his efforts had produced such tangible, positive results? "There's something else," Doc continued, his tone shifting to something more serious. "Something I should probably mention." Thomas felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in his stomach. Good news in his experience was often followed by complications. "I've been asking around about this horse, trying to piece together his history. Old man Miller wasn't much for record-keeping, especially toward the end when things got bad for him. But I talked to his neighbor, Frank Carver, and he remembers when Miller first got this horse." Doc paused, and Thomas could hear him shifting his weight from one foot to the other, the way he did when he was uncomfortable about something. "Frank thinks this horse might have come from the Riverside stables. You remember that place? Used to breed quarter horses for rodeo work, maybe 15 years ago." Thomas remembered Riverside stables. They'd had a reputation for producing solid, athletic horses with good bloodlines. The kind of animals that cost serious money, not the kind that ended up neglected in a back pasture. "If Frank's right," Doc continued, "this horse might have more potential than either of us realized. The bone structure's certainly there. Good legs, strong back, intelligent head. Makes me wonder what his story really is." The implications of Doc's words settled over Thomas like a heavy blanket. If Spirit had come from good breeding stock, if he'd once been a valuable animal, then his recovery might mean more than just saving a sick horse. It might mean Thomas had stumbled onto something that could actually help his financial situation. But even as the thought occurred to him, Thomas found himself rejecting it. Spirit wasn't a commodity to be evaluated and sold. He was a living being who'd been discarded and forgotten, who'd found his way back to health through patience and care. The idea of profiting from that recovery felt somehow wrong. After Doc left, Thomas spent the afternoon working on ranch maintenance, but his mind kept returning to the veterinarian's words. Spirit followed him along the fence line as he worked, staying close enough that Thomas could hear his breathing, could reach out and touch him when he needed the reassurance of contact. The horse had become more than a patient or a project. He'd become a companion, someone to talk to during the long hours when the silence of the ranch threatened to overwhelm Thomas's spirits. More than that, caring for Spirit had given Thomas a sense of purpose that had been missing since Sarah's death. When evening came, Thomas prepared Spirit's dinner with the same careful attention he'd given every meal for the past 2 weeks. The routine had become meditation, a series of actions that centered his thoughts and reminded him that he was still capable of nurturing life, still able to make a positive difference in the world. Spirit greeted him at the fence with the gentle nicker that had become their evening ritual. The horse's coat gleamed in the fading light, no longer the dull, lifeless covering of a sick animal, but something that caught and reflected the last rays of sunlight. As Spirit ate, Thomas reflected on the changes in both of them. The horse had regained his physical health, but Thomas realized he'd found something to a reason to get up in the morning, a living reminder that healing was possible even when the damage seemed too severe to overcome. The evening air carried the scent of approaching autumn, and Thomas could hear the distant sounds of geese heading south for the winter. Change was coming, as it always did, but for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of what it might bring. "We're doing pretty good, aren't we, Spirit?" he said, running his hand along the horse's shoulder. "Both of us healing up, both of us finding our way." Spirit lifted his head from the feed bucket and pressed his muzzle against Thomas's chest, a gesture of affection that spoke louder than words. In that moment, standing in the gathering dusk with a recovered horse, breathing warm against his shirt, Thomas felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. He felt whole. The photograph lay face down in the dirt of Spirit's stall, its edges curled from 3 years of being carried in Thomas's shirt pocket. He'd reached for his handkerchief, and the picture had tumbled out, landing where Spirit's hooves had packed the earth smooth as concrete. Thomas knelt carefully, his fingers finding the familiar shape of the frame, and for a moment he could see Sarah's face as clearly as if his sight had returned. Their wedding day, 1976. Sarah in her grandmother's dress, him in a borrowed suit that was too tight in the shoulders. Both of them grinning like they'd discovered a secret the rest of the world hadn't figured out yet. She'd been 22, he'd been 24, and they'd thought they had forever stretched out ahead of them like an endless prairie. "Found something in there with you, did I?" Thomas asked Spirit, who had wandered over to investigate the human crouched in his living space. The horse's breath warmed the back of Thomas's neck as he carefully tucked the photograph back into his pocket, next to his heart where it belonged. 4 weeks had passed since the auction, and Spirit's transformation continued to amaze everyone who saw him. The skeletal horse that nobody wanted had filled out considerably, his ribs no longer visible beneath a coat that was growing thicker and more lustrous with each passing day. But the changes went deeper than physical appearance. Spirit had developed a personality, a presence that commanded attention in ways that had nothing to do with his previous sorry state. Thomas could feel it in the way Spirit moved with purpose now, with the fluid grace of an athlete returning to form. The horse had begun showing off, prancing around the corral when he thought Thomas was watching, tossing his head and snorting like a young stallion full of spring energy. "You're getting awful proud of yourself," Thomas told him, running his hands along Spirit's neck to check the new muscle development there. "Pretty soon you'll be too good for the likes of me." But even as he joked, Thomas felt a growing unease that had nothing to do with Spirit's recovery. The better the horse looked, the more attention he drew from the neighbors and townspeople who stopped by to see the miracle transformation. Most of them meant well, but their comments carried implications that made Thomas uncomfortable. "That's turning into quite a valuable animal," Bill Preston had said just yesterday. "Might be worth having him appraised. See what kind of investment you made. Could probably get 10 times what you paid for him now," added Frank Carver, who'd driven over specifically to get a look at Spirit. "Horse like that, in good condition, he's worth serious money." The word money seemed to follow Spirit around like a shadow now. Thomas understood the practical reality. He needed income, the ranch needed repairs, and Spirit represented potential financial salvation. But every time someone suggested selling the horse, something in Thomas's chest tightened like a fist. The morning's mail had brought another letter from Jake Morrison, the third one this month. Each offer for the ranch property was higher than the last, and each one came with the same gentle pressure disguised as friendly concern for Thomas's welfare. "Thomas," the latest letter read, "I know you're attached to that place, but winter's coming, and maintenance on a ranch is getting beyond what one man can handle, especially with your situation. My offer stands, and it's more than fair market value. You could take the money, buy yourself a nice little place in town, and not have to worry about cattle and feed bills anymore. Your situation." That's how people referred to his blindness now, like it was a temporary inconvenience that would resolve itself if everyone just pretended it wasn't permanent. Thomas folded the letter and stuffed it into his jacket pocket, next to Sarah's photograph. Jake Morrison's offers were becoming harder to ignore, especially when the bills kept piling up and the bank account kept shrinking. But the idea of selling the ranch felt like abandoning the last connection he had to the life he'd built with Sarah. "What do you think, boy?" he asked Spirit, who had finished his morning grain and was investigating the fence posts with the curiosity of an animal that was rediscovering the world around him. "Think I'm being foolish, hanging on to this place?" Spirit didn't answer, but his presence felt like comfort anyway. The horse had become Thomas's sounding board, the recipient of thoughts and worries that had nowhere else to go. It was easier to voice his fears to an animal that couldn't judge him, couldn't offer advice that came wrapped in pity or impatience. The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted his brooding. Thomas recognized the engine note of Doc Henderson's truck, but there was another vehicle with him, something with a diesel engine that spoke of serious business rather than social calls. "Morning, Thomas," Doc called out as the engines shut off. "Brought someone to meet you. This is Jim Walker from the Regional Livestock Association. He's been hearing stories about your horse." Thomas felt his shoulders tense automatically. Official visits usually meant complications, and he'd had enough complications to last several lifetimes. "Mr. Mackenzie," Jim Walker's voice carried the professional courtesy of a man conducting business rather than making friends. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I've been getting calls about a horse that's made quite a recovery. Mind if I take a look?" There wasn't really a polite way to refuse, so Thomas led the two men to Spirit's corral. He listened as Jim Walker's boots circled the fence, could hear the man's intake of breath when he got his first clear look at Spirit. "Well, I'll be," Walker said quietly. "Doc, you weren't exaggerating. That's a remarkable animal." Thomas felt a familiar surge of pride mixed with protective anxiety. Compliments about Spirit always seemed to come with hidden price tags. "Mr. Mackenzie," Walker continued, "I don't know if you're aware of this, but I think your horse might have some significant breeding in his background. The conformation, the way he carries himself, the bone structure, all of it suggests quality bloodlines." Here it comes, Thomas thought. The suggestion that Spirit belonged somewhere else, with someone else, in circumstances that didn't include a blind cowboy on a failing ranch. "Have you considered having him professionally evaluated?" Walker asked. "There are people who specialize in identifying bloodlines, tracing pedigrees. If this horse is what I think he might be, we could be talking about substantial value." That word again. Value. As if Spirit's worth could be reduced to numbers on an appraisal sheet. "I bought him for $50, Thomas said carefully. "As far as I'm concerned, that's what he cost and that's what he's worth to me." But even as he spoke the words, Thomas knew they weren't entirely true. Spirit was worth far more than $50 to him. The horse had become his companion, his purpose, his daily reminder that healing was possible. The question was whether that emotional value would be enough to sustain them both when the practical realities of ranch life demanded more substantial solutions. After the visitors left, Thomas returned to Spirit's corral and found the horse waiting for him by the gate, as if sensing his human's need for comfort. The photograph in his pocket seemed to pulse with warmth against his chest, a reminder of other times when difficult decisions had to be made, when love and practicality pulled in different directions. "Sarah would know what to do," he told Spirit. "She always knew what to do." But Sarah was gone, and Thomas was left to navigate these waters alone, guided only by the sound of Spirit's breathing and the fading memory of a woman who'd believed that broken things could always find their way back to wholeness. The rope halter took Thomas 3 tries to get right. His fingers, once so sure with knots and leather work, fumbled with the simple braiding pattern Sarah had taught him decades ago. But Spirit stood patiently while Thomas worked, occasionally nudging his shoulder as if to encourage the effort. "There," Thomas said finally, slipping the finished halter over Spirit's head. The rope felt right in his hands, not the frayed, store-bought thing the horse had worn at the auction, but something made specifically for him, adjusted to fit his head properly, crafted with the kind of attention that spoke of care rather than mere convenience. 6 weeks had passed since the auction, and Spirit's transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The hollow-eyed, defeated animal had become a horse that drew admiring glances from everyone who saw him. His coat gleamed with health, his eyes were bright and alert, and he moved with the fluid grace of an athlete in prime condition. More importantly, the bond between Thomas and Spirit had deepened into something that transcended the simple relationship between owner and animal. Spirit had learned to respond to Thomas's voice commands with an intelligence that surprised even Doc Henderson. A soft click of the tongue brought the horse to attention. A whispered, "Easy," calmed him when something startled him. And the gentle pressure of Thomas's hand on his neck was enough to guide him in any direction. "You're getting too smart for your own good," Thomas told Spirit as he led him around the corral using nothing but voice commands and the light touch of the rope halter. "Pretty soon you'll be doing my taxes and fixing the roof." The joke carried an undercurrent of truth that made Thomas uneasy. Spirit's intelligence was becoming impossible to ignore, and with it came questions about the horse's background that Thomas wasn't sure he wanted answered. Animals didn't learn this quickly unless they'd been trained before, didn't respond with such precision unless someone had spent considerable time teaching them. The morning's mail had brought another surpriser letter from the editor of the county newspaper asking permission to feature Thomas and Spirit's story in the weekend edition. Word of the remarkable recovery had spread beyond the immediate neighborhood, apparently, and people were interested in reading about the blind cowboy who'd saved a dying horse. Thomas wasn't sure how he felt about the attention. Part of him was proud of what they'd accomplished together, proud of Spirit's recovery and the role he'd played in it. But another part worried about what kind of notice the story might attract, what kind of people might come looking for a horse that was clearly worth more than the $50 Thomas had paid. "What do you think, boy?" Thomas asked Spirit as they practiced their morning routine. "Think we're ready for our 15 minutes of fame?" Spirit's response was to nuzzle Thomas's pocket, searching for the sugar cubes that had become part of their ritual. The horse had developed a sweet tooth that rivaled a child's, and Thomas found himself buying sugar specifically for Spirit's treats. The sound of multiple vehicles approaching interrupted their training session. Thomas recognized Doc Henderson's truck, but there were others with it, cars and trucks that spoke of a delegation rather than a casual visit. "Thomas," Doc called out as the engines shut off. "Hope you don't mind company. Word's gotten out about Spirit, and some folks wanted to see him for themselves." What followed was the most surreal hour of Thomas's life since the accident. A parade of visitors circled Spirit's corral, each one more amazed than the last at the horse's condition and behavior. There was Mary Chen from the newspaper, her camera clicking constantly as she documented Spirit's movements. Jim Walker had returned with two other livestock specialists, their professional jargon filling the air with talk of bloodlines and confirmation and potential. But the visitor who made Thomas most nervous was a man named Robert Steinberg, who introduced himself as a representative of something called the American Quarter Horse Heritage Foundation. "Mr. Mackenzie," Steinberg said in the careful tone of someone delivering potentially explosive news, "I've been studying your horse, and I believe he may be a significant animal. The markings, the build, the way he moves, everything suggests he might be connected to some very important bloodlines." Thomas felt the familiar knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. Connected how? There was a stallion named Thunder's Pride, bred by Riverside Stables in the early 2000s, one of the finest quarter horses ever produced in this region. He sired several champions before he disappeared about 10 years ago. "Based on what I'm seeing, I think your horse might be Thunder's Pride himself." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Thunder's Pride. Even he had heard of that horsey legend in quarter horse circles, worth more money than Thomas's entire ranch. If Spirit was really Thunder's Pride, then everything changed. The horse didn't belong to a blind cowboy on a failing ranch. He belonged to the world of champions and breeding programs and people who understood his true value. "That's quite a theory," Thomas managed to say. "It's more than a theory," Steinberg replied. "I've brought some photographs, some documentation. With your permission, I'd like to do a thorough examination, maybe take some measurements. If I'm right, this could be the most significant horse find in decades." After the visitors left, Thomas sat on the fence rail with his head in his hands, listening to Spirit move around the corral. The horse seemed restless, picking up on Thomas's emotional turmoil with the sensitivity that had developed between them over the weeks of constant contact. The implications of Steinberg's visit were staggering. If Spirit was really Thunder's Pride, then Thomas's $50 purchase at a livestock auction would go down in horse breeding history. But more than that, it would mean Spirit had a past, a previous life that had nothing to do with Thomas or their shared journey of healing. It would mean Spirit belonged somewhere else. "Come here, boy," Thomas called softly, and Spirit approached immediately, pressing his head against Thomas's chest in the gesture that had become their private language of comfort. Thomas ran his hands over the horse's face, feeling the familiar contours that had become as recognizable to him as his own reflection had once been. Whether Spirit was Thunder's Pride or just a nameless horse that somebody had thrown away, he was still the same animal that had trusted Thomas with his recovery, that had given Thomas a reason to get up every morning. "Doesn't matter what they call you," Thomas whispered into Spirit's ear. "Doesn't matter what papers you might have or who you used to belong to. Right here, right now, your spirit, you're mine, and I'm yours, and that's all that matters. But even as he spoke the words, Thomas knew the situation had become more complicated than he could handle alone. If Spirit really was Thunder's pride, then people would come looking for him. People with legal claims and financial interests and resources that a blind cowboy couldn't match. The rope halter he'd made that morning suddenly felt like a symbol of something precious and fragile, a connection that might not survive the forces that were gathering around them like storm clouds on the horizon. As the sun set behind the mountains, Thomas remained by the fence, listening to Spirit's quiet breathing and trying to prepare himself for whatever was coming next. The photograph in his pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, reminding him of Sarah's voice during their own difficult times. Sometimes the right thing and the easy thing aren't the same thing, Thomas, but you always know which one you have to choose. The question was whether he'd be strong enough to make that choice when the time came. The blue ribbon was tangled in Spirit's mane like a forgotten dream. Thomas's fingers found it during their morning grooming routine, hidden beneath the thick hair that had grown back full and lustrous over the past 2 months. The silk felt expensive against his weathered skin, and when he worked it free, he could feel the raised lettering of words embossed in gold. "What's this you've been hiding from me?" Thomas asked Spirit, who stood perfectly still as Thomas examined the ribbon with his fingertips. The horse's behavior had changed over the past few days, becoming more restless, more alert to sounds from beyond the ranch, as if he was remembering something that had been buried under months of illness and neglect. Thomas made his way to the house, the ribbon clutched carefully in his hand. His fingers traced the embossed lettering over and over, trying to decode the message that might explain everything about Spirit's mysterious past. The gold thread felt real, substantial, the kind of thing that came with serious accomplishments, not county fair participation prizes. "Doc," Thomas said into the phone, his voice tight with anticipation. "I need you to come over. Found something that might be important." 20 minutes later, Doc Henderson's truck pulled into the yard with unusual urgency. Thomas met him at the corral, the ribbon still clutched in his palm like evidence in a criminal case. "What's got you so worked up?" Doc asked, but his tone changed when Thomas handed him the ribbon. There was a long silence, and Thomas could practically hear Doc's sharp intake of breath. "Jesus Christ, Thomas, do you know what this is? I was hoping you could tell me." "This is a championship ribbon from the National Quarter Horse Congress, 2008. First place in the 2-year-old futurity division." Doc's voice carried the weight of someone delivering earth-shaking news. "Thomas, this ribbon is worth more than some people's cars." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd known Spirit was special, had sensed the horse's quality from the beginning, but this was different. This was proof that Spirit wasn't just a well-bred animal, he was a champion, a horse that had competed at the highest levels of the sport. "There's more," Doc continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The name on the ribbon, it says Thunder's Pride." Thomas felt the world shift beneath his feet. Thunder's Pride, the legendary stallion that Robert Steinberg had speculated about just days earlier. Not speculation anymore, fact, documented in gold thread and blue silk. "How is that possible?" Thomas asked, sinking onto the fence rail as the implications crashed over him like a wave. "How does a champion horse end up sick and dying at a livestock auction?" "I don't know," Doc replied, "but I think we need to find out." The rest of the morning became a whirlwind of phone calls and research. Doc contacted his network of veterinary colleagues, while Thomas tried to piece together what little he knew about Thunder's Pride's history. The horse had dominated quarter horse competition in the late 2000s, winning multiple championships before disappearing from the show circuit around 2010. The official story was that Thunder's Pride had been retired to stud, but no breeding records could be found. It was as if the horse had simply vanished from the sport that had made him famous. By noon, the ranch was once again filled with visitors, but this time the atmosphere was different. Robert Steinberg arrived with a folder full of documentation, his excitement barely contained as he confirmed what the ribbon had already revealed. Mary Chen from the newspaper brought a photographer, understanding that this story had just become much bigger than a feel-good piece about animal rescue. Most troubling of all, a lawyer named Patricia Wells arrived with questions about ownership and legal title that made Thomas's head spin. "The situation is complicated," Wells explained as they sat around Thomas's kitchen table. Thunder's Pride was owned by Riverside Stables until 2010, when the facility was sold to settle debts. The horse should have been part of that sale, but there's no record of him being transferred to the new owners. "So who owns him now?" Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. "That's what we need to determine. If the original ownership was never properly transferred, then technically Thunder's Pride still belongs to the estate of Riverside Stables. But if he was sold legitimately to Old Man Miller, then your purchase at the auction gives you clear title." Thomas felt a crushing weight settle on his chest. The idea that Spirit might be taken away from him, that their bond might be dismissed as legally irrelevant, was almost more than he could bear. "What does this mean for Thomas?" Doc asked, his voice carrying the protective edge of a friend defending a friend. "It means we need to investigate the chain of ownership very carefully," Wells replied. "If there are competing claims, this could end up in court. A horse of Thunder's Pride's stature and breeding value represents significant money, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars." After the visitors left, Thomas sat in Spirit's corral, his back against the fence post, trying to process what his life had become in the space of a single morning. The horse that had been his salvation, his companion, his reason for getting up each day, was apparently worth more money than Thomas had ever dreamed of possessing. But more than that, Spirit was Thunder's Prideer legend, a champion, an animal that belonged to the world of professional breeding and competition, not to a blind cowboy on a failing ranch in Montana. Spirit approached and lowered his head to Thomas's shoulder, sensing his human's distress with the emotional intelligence that had developed between them. The gesture was so familiar, so much a part of their daily routine, that it brought tears to Thomas's eyes. "What are we going to do, boy?" Thomas whispered into Spirit's ear. "How do we fight people who have lawyers and money and legal claims?" The horse didn't answer, but his steady breathing and warm presence provided the only comfort Thomas could find in a world that had suddenly become much more complicated and threatening. As evening approached, Thomas remained in the corral, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. The blue ribbon lay on the ground beside him, its golden letters catching the last light of the setting sun. It was beautiful and valuable and completely devastating to everything Thomas had believed about his life with Spirit. The phone rang in the house, its insistent tone carrying across the yard like a warning. Thomas knew without answering that it would be someone else with questions about Thunder's Pride, someone else with claims and demands and legal theories about who the horse really belonged to. But for now, in the gathering dusk, there was just Thomas and Spirit, sitting quietly together as they had every evening for the past 2 months. Whatever came next, whatever battles lay ahead, this moment was theirs, and Thomas was determined to hold on to it for as long as possible. The champion's ribbon fluttered in the evening breeze, a piece of silk and gold that had changed everything and nothing at the same time. Spirit was still Spirit, regardless of what name was embroidered on his prizes. The question was whether love and care would be enough to keep him where he belonged, or whether the law would demand its own kind of justice. The legal documents arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt too ordinary for such momentous news. Thomas heard the mail truck's familiar rattle in his driveway, followed by the sound of papers being stuffed into his mailbox with more force than usual. When he retrieved them, his fingers found an envelope thick enough to contain trouble. Doc Henderson read the contents aloud in Thomas's kitchen an hour later, his voice growing more grim with each paragraph. The Riverside Stables estate, represented by the law firm of Morrison, Patterson, Prapus Associates, was filing a claim for immediate return of the horse known as Thunder's Pride, along with damages for his care and maintenance during the period of unlawful possession. "They want him back, Thomas," Doc said quietly, "and they want you to pay for the privilege of having taken care of him." Thomas sat at his kitchen table, The same table where he and Sarah had shared breakfast every morning for 25 years, and felt the walls of his world closing in. The lawyers were claiming that Thunder's Pride had never been legally sold to Old Man Miller, that his appearance at the auction was the result of theft or fraud, and that Thomas's purchase was therefore invalid. "How long do I have?" Thomas asked. "The hearing is scheduled for next Friday. 1 week." Doc's voice carried the weight of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis. "They're asking for immediate custody, pending the court's decision." The days that followed blurred together in a haze of preparation and desperation. Patricia Wells, the lawyer who'd been helping Thomas understand his legal position, worked around the clock trying to establish a legitimate chain of ownership. But the records from Riverside stables were incomplete. Old Man Miller was dead, and the auction house had sold dozens of horses with questionable documentation over the years. "The problem," Wells explained during one of their strategy sessions, "is that Thunder's Pride's value works against us. If this were a $50 horse with no particular breeding or accomplishments, nobody would care about the paperwork. But we're talking about a champion stallion worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The court is going to be very careful about who has the right to keep him." Thomas spent his evenings in Spirit's corral, trying to maintain their normal routine while battling the growing certainty that their time together was coming to an end. The horse seemed to sense the tension, becoming increasingly restless and protective. When strangers approached the fence, Spirit would position himself between them and Thomas, ears pinned back in warning. "You know something's wrong, don't you, boy?" Thomas said, running his hands over Spirit's neck in the gesture that had become their private language of comfort. "You can feel it too." The community response surprised Thomas with its intensity. Mary Chen's newspaper article about the legal battle had sparked outrage among local residents who saw the case as big city lawyers trying to steal a horse from a man who'd saved its life. Neighbors who'd barely spoken to Thomas since his accident suddenly appeared at his door, offering support, money, testimony, anything that might help. Bill Preston organized a legal defense fund that raised $3,000 in 4 days. Frank Carver offered to testify about Old Man Miller's legitimate ownership of the horse. Even Jake Morrison, who'd been pressuring Thomas to sell his ranch, stopped by to offer his support. "Don't matter what papers they wave around," Morrison said, surprising Thomas with his vehemence. "That horse was dying when you took him. You saved his life, and that ought to count for something in any reasonable court." But reasonable wasn't guaranteed, as Patricia Wells reminded Thomas repeatedly. The law was about documentation and ownership rights, not about emotional bonds or moral victories. If the Riverside estate could prove their case, Thomas would lose Spirit, regardless of how much love and care had gone into his recovery. Doc Henderson spent the week gathering medical records and photographs that documented Spirit's condition at the time of purchase. The before and after evidence was stark X-rays, showing the horse's malnourished state, photographs of his infected wounds and matted coat, veterinary reports detailing the extent of his illness. "If nothing else," Doc said, "we can show the court what kind of condition Thunder's Pride was in when you bought him. They were ready to put him down rather than spend money on treatment." The night before the hearing, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat on his front porch listening to the sounds of his ranch cattle lowing in the distance, the wind through the cottonwoods, the familiar creak of the windmill that still needed oil. These were the sounds of home, of the life he'd built with Sarah and tried to maintain alone. In the corral, Spirit paced restlessly, his hooves drumming against the packed earth in a rhythm that spoke of anxiety and confusion. The horse had developed a routine built around Thomas's presence, and the disruption of that routine was clearly causing distress. Around midnight, Thomas made his way to the corral and climbed over the fence. Spirit approached immediately, pressing his head against Thomas's chest in their familiar greeting. For a long time, neither of them moved, just two beings finding comfort in each other's presence while the world prepared to tear them apart. "I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow," Thomas told Spirit, "but I want you to know that these past few months have been the best I've had since Sarah died. You gave me something to care about, something to get up for every morning. Whether you're Thunder's Pride or just Spirit, you'll always be the horse that saved my life as much as I saved yours." Spirit's response was to wrap his neck around Thomas's shoulders, holding him in something that felt remarkably like an embrace. The gesture was so human, so clearly intentional, that it brought tears to Thomas's eyes. As dawn broke over the mountains, Thomas prepared for what might be his last morning routine with Spirit. The familiar tasks, mixing grain with supplements, checking water, examining the horse's condition, took on a poignancy that made every moment feel precious. The convoy of vehicles that arrived to transport them to the courthouse looked more like a funeral procession than a legal proceeding. Patricia Wells rode in the lead car, her briefcase full of arguments and documentation that might or might not be enough to keep Thomas and Spirit together. Doc Henderson drove Thomas in his old pickup truck, the same vehicle that had brought so much veterinary care to Spirit over the past months. The horse trailer followed behind, carrying Spirit toward a hearing that would determine his fate. "Whatever happens," Doc said as they pulled into the courthouse parking lot, "you did right by that horse. Don't let anybody tell you different." Thomas nodded, but his throat was too tight for words. Through the truck's window, he could hear Spirit moving restlessly in the trailer, could imagine the confusion and fear the horse must be feeling at being transported to an unfamiliar place surrounded by strangers. The courthouse steps felt steeper than they should have, and Thomas's walking stick tapped against the concrete with unusual uncertainty. Behind him, he could hear the voices of neighbors and supporters who'd driven to town to witness the proceedings. Their presence was comforting, but it couldn't change the fundamental question at the heart of the case. Did love and care create ownership, or was ownership simply a matter of legal documents and financial transactions? In a few hours, a judge would decide not just the fate of a horse, but the nature of the bond between a blind man and the animal that had given him back his purpose in life. As they entered the courthouse, Thomas's hand moved unconsciously to his shirt pocket, where Sarah's photograph rested next to his heart. He was going to need all the strength she'd ever given him to face whatever came next. The judge's gavel rested on the bench like a wooden promise of finality. Thomas could hear it there, silent but present, waiting to render the decision that would determine whether he and Spirit would go home together or be separated forever. Judge Margaret Harrison had a reputation for fairness, but fairness in legal matters didn't always align with fairness in matters of the heart. Thomas sat in the front row of the courtroom, his hands folded in his lap, listening to the sounds of a formal proceeding that would reduce months of love and healing to arguments about ownership and legal precedent. "Your Honor," began the lawyer representing the Riverside Stables estate, "this case is quite straightforward. Thunder's Pride is a registered champion quarter horse with documented breeding rights worth approximately $400,000. The defendant purchased this animal for $50 at a livestock auction under circumstances that suggest the seller had no legal right to the property. $400,000. The number hung in the air like smoke, making Thomas feel foolish forever, thinking his $50 investment could stand up to that kind of value. But then Patricia Wells rose to present his defense, and Thomas remembered that some things couldn't be measured in money. "Your Honor," Wells said, "Thomas Mackenzie purchased this horse in good faith from a legitimate auction. More importantly, he purchased an animal that was ours from an animal that the previous caretakers had allowed to deteriorate to the point where euthanasia was the humane option. Mackenzie's care and dedication saved Thunder's Pride's life." The testimony began with Robert Steinberg, who confirmed Thunder's Pride's identity and value with the clinical precision of an expert witness. His words painted a picture of a legendary animal whose breeding potential represented a small fortune in the competitive world of quarter horse racing. Then came the estate's lawyer, who presented documentation showing that Thunder's Pride had never been legally transferred to Old Man Miller, that his appearance at the auction was the result of confusion and poor record-keeping rather than legitimate sale. Thomas listened to each witness with growing dread. The legal case against him was strong, built on documentation and precedent that his emotional arguments couldn't overcome. When Patricia Wells called him to testify on his own behalf, Thomas's legs felt unsteady as he made his way to the witness stand. "Mr. Mackenzie," Wells began gently, "please tell the court about the condition of the horse you purchased at the Miller auction." Thomas's voice was steady as he described Spirit's condition that day, the labored breathing, the visible ribs, the listless demeanor of an animal that had given up hope. He spoke about the late-night vigils, the careful feeding schedule, the gradual transformation from dying horse to healthy companion. "And during this recovery period," Wells continued, "did anyone from the Riverside estate contact you about the horse's identity or ownership?" "No, ma'am. Not until after he'd recovered completely." The cross-examination was brutal. The estate's lawyer pressed Thomas about his knowledge of the horse's value, suggesting that he'd knowingly purchased stolen property and hidden Thunder's Pride's identity to avoid legitimate ownership claims. "Mr. Mackenzie," the lawyer said with barely concealed contempt, "are you telling this court that you had no idea you were purchasing a champion quarter horse worth hundreds of thousands of dollars?" "I knew I was purchasing a sick horse that nobody else wanted," Thomas replied firmly. "A horse that was dying while people walked away because they didn't want to spend money on veterinary care. But surely a man with your experience would recognize quality breeding even in a compromised animal." Thomas felt his temper rising but kept his voice level. "What I recognized was an animal in pain that needed help. Everything else was just speculation until we found that ribbon." Doc Henderson's testimony provided the medical foundation for Thomas's case. He presented X-rays, photographs, and detailed veterinary records that documented Spirit's condition at the time of purchase and throughout his recovery. "In your professional opinion," Patricia Wells asked, "what would have happened to this horse if Mr. Mackenzie hadn't purchased him?" "He would have died within days," Doc replied without hesitation. "The pneumonia alone was advanced enough to be fatal. Add in the malnutrition and general neglect, and euthanasia would have been the only humane option." "And the current condition of the animal?" "Complete recovery. Better than complete, he's in the best condition I've seen in a horse his age. Mr. Mackenzie's care has been exemplary." The estate's lawyer tried to minimize Doc's testimony, suggesting that any competent veterinarian could have achieved the same results with proper funding. But Doc's response carried the weight of 50 years of experience. "Money doesn't heal animals," he said firmly. "Care does, attention does. The kind of round-the-clock dedication that Mr. Mackenzie provided can't be purchased. It can only be given." The community witnesses followed neighbors who testified to Thomas's character, the auction house representative who confirmed the legitimacy of the sale, even Jake Morrison, who surprised everyone by speaking passionately about Thomas's right to keep the horse he'd saved. But the most powerful testimony came from Mary Chen, the newspaper reporter who documented Spirit's transformation. "Your Honor," she said, "I've covered dozens of animal stories over the years, but I've never seen anything like the bond between Mr. Mackenzie and this horse. It goes beyond ownership, beyond legal technicalities. What I witnessed was two beings healing each other, creating something that transcends property law." As the morning wore on, Thomas could feel the weight of the proceedings pressing down on him like a physical force. The legal arguments swirled around him, precedents and property rights, documentation and financial valuations, but all he could think about was Spirit, waiting in the courthouse parking lot, confused and frightened by the unfamiliar surroundings. When the court recessed for lunch, Thomas made his way outside to check on his horse. Spirit's ears pricked forward at the sound of Thomas's voice, and he nickered softly in greeting. The simple sound nearly broke Thomas's heart. "I don't know what's going to happen," Thomas told Spirit, reaching through the trailer slats to touch the horse's neck. "But whatever they decide, you need to know that these months with you have been a gift. You gave me back my life, boy. No matter what happens, that's something nobody can take away." Spirit pressed his muzzle against Thomas's hand, a gesture of trust and affection that felt like a promise. Around them, the courthouse buzzed with activity as lawyers and witnesses prepared for the afternoon session that would determine their fate. Patricia Wells approached with a grim expression. "The estate's case is strong, Thomas." They have documentation, they have legal precedent, and they have the financial resources to pursue this through appeals if necessary. What are our chances? Honestly, maybe 30%. Judge Harrison is sympathetic to your situation, but the law is pretty clear about property rights. Unless we can prove that Old Man Miller had legitimate ownership, or unless something dramatic happens in the afternoon session, I think we're going to lose. Thomas nodded, having expected as much. The law was about documents and precedents, not about love and healing. He'd known from the beginning that the odds were against them. But as they prepared to return to the courtroom, Thomas felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. Whatever happened, he'd fought for Spirit with everything he had. Sometimes that was all a man could do. Judge Harrison's voice carried the weight of Solomon's wisdom as she addressed the packed courtroom. This case presents an unusual situation where legal ownership and moral stewardship appear to be in conflict. After reviewing all testimony and evidence, I find myself in the position of making a decision that will satisfy the law while attempting to serve justice. Thomas held his breath, his fingers gripping the edge of his chair. Around him, the courtroom was silent, except for the soft scratch of the court reporter's fingers on her keyboard. The documentation presented by the Riverside Stables estate establishes a prima facie case for their ownership of the horse known as Thunder's Pride, the judge continued. However, the circumstances surrounding this animal's care and recovery present compelling counter-arguments that cannot be ignored. The estate's lawyer leaned forward, confident in his legal position. Patricia Wells sat rigid beside Thomas, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Therefore, Judge Harrison said, I am ordering an unusual resolution to this dispute. The horse will be brought into this courtroom, and we will allow the animal himself to determine where his loyalties and comfort lie. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Thomas felt his heart stop. In all his years of legal precedent research, Patricia Wells had never encountered a judge who'd allowed an animal to influence custody decisions. Your Honor, the estate's lawyer protested, with respect, this is highly irregular. Property law doesn't recognize animal preference as a determining factor in ownership disputes. Property law, Judge Harrison replied firmly, also doesn't typically deal with cases where the alleged property was rescued from death by the defendant. This court recognizes that Thunder's Pride is not merely property, he is a living being whose welfare must be considered alongside legal technicalities. 20 minutes later, the courthouse doors opened to allow Spirit's entry. Thomas heard the familiar sound of hooves on hard flooring, accompanied by the gentle guidance of court officers who'd volunteered to handle the unusual situation. Spirit entered the courtroom with his head held high, alert and curious about the strange environment. Thomas could hear the horse's breathing, slightly elevated from nervousness but strong and healthy. The sound filled him with pride, despite his fear of the outcome. Mr. Mackenzie, Judge Harrison said, please approach the center of the courtroom. Thomas rose from his chair, his walking stick tapping against the marble floor as he made his way to the designated spot. Behind him, he could hear the collective intake of breath from the spectators who'd come to witness this unprecedented proceeding. Mr. Steinberg, the judge continued, addressing the estate's representative, you may also approach and call to the horse. Robert Steinberg moved to the opposite side of the courtroom, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor. Thomas could hear him clearing his throat, preparing to call to an animal he'd only recently identified. The courtroom fell silent as both men stood equidistant from Spirit, who remained near the doors where the court officers had positioned him. Thomas could hear the horse's ears swiveling, taking in the unfamiliar sounds and scents of the formal environment. Thunder's Pride, Steinberg called in his professional voice. Come here, boy. Come to me. The horse didn't move. Thomas could hear Spirit's breathing, could sense the animal's confusion at being called by a name he'd rarely heard, by a voice that held no warmth or familiarity. Spirit, Thomas called softly, using the same gentle tone he'd employed during countless mornings of feeding and grooming. Come here, boy. It's okay. The response was immediate and unmistakable. Spirit's hooves rang against the courthouse floor as he crossed the space between them, moving directly to Thomas without hesitation. The horse pressed his muzzle against Thomas's chest in their familiar greeting, nickering softly in recognition and relief. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Even Judge Harrison seemed moved by the obvious bond between man and horse. "Thunder's pride," Steinberg called again more insistently. "Here, boy. Come here." But Spirit remained pressed against Thomas, his head resting on the man's shoulder, in a gesture that spoke louder than any legal document. When Thomas raised his hand to stroke the horse's neck, Spirit leaned into the touch with obvious contentment. "The animal has made his choice clear," Judge Harrison observed. "But let us test this further. Mr. Mackenzie, please move to the opposite side of the courtroom." Thomas's heart sank. The judge was being thorough, ensuring that Spirit's choice wasn't simply based on proximity or convenience. He walked across the courtroom, his stick guiding him to the far wall, leaving Spirit standing alone in the center. "Mr. Steinberg, please call to him again." "Thunder's pride, come here. Good boy, come to me." Once again, Spirit ignored the call completely. The horse turned his head toward Thomas, ears pricked forward, clearly searching for his human companion. "Spirit," Thomas called from across the room. "Come here, boy." Without hesitation, Spirit crossed the courtroom again, his hooves echoing in the silence as he went directly to Thomas. This time, the horse positioned himself protectively between Thomas and the rest of the room, as if shielding his human from the strange environment. The estate's lawyer made one final attempt. "Your Honor, this proves nothing. The animal simply responds to the voice he's familiar with. Legal ownership cannot be determined by—" "Legal ownership," Judge Harrison interrupted, "is exactly what this court is here to determine. And I have just witnessed the most compelling evidence possible that this animal belongs with the man who saved his life." Thomas felt tears stinging his eyes as the judge's words sank in. Spirit remained pressed against his side, solid and warm and unmistakably choosing their bond over the financial interests of strangers. "Therefore," Judge Harrison continued, "this court finds that the care and dedication demonstrated by Thomas Mackenzie, combined with the animal's clear preference for his company, supersedes the technical ownership claims of the Riverside Stables estate. Mr. Mackenzie's purchase at the auction is hereby deemed legal and binding." The gavel fell with a sound like thunder, and the courtroom exploded in applause. Thomas buried his face in Spirit's neck, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude that threatened to buckle his knees. "Furthermore," the judge added as the noise subsided, "given the extraordinary circumstances of this case and the obvious welfare of the animal involved, this court orders that the Riverside Stables estate pay Mr. Mackenzie's legal costs as compensation for the stress and expense of this unnecessary litigation." Thomas felt hands clapping his shoulders, heard Doc Henderson's distinctive laugh of triumph, sensed the crowd of supporters gathering around them in celebration. But all of his attention was focused on Spirit, who remained calm and steady beside him, despite the chaos of victory. "We did it, boy," Thomas whispered into the horse's ear. "We're going home together." Spirit's response was to wrap his neck around Thomas's shoulders in something that felt exactly like an embrace, holding him close while the courtroom celebrated around them. In that moment, Thomas understood that they hadn't just won a legal battle, they'd proven that love and care could triumph over money and power, that the bond between two beings who'd healed each other was stronger than any document or financial claim. The gavel had fallen, but the real victory was in the steady warmth of Spirit's breathing against his cheek, the familiar scent of the horse who'd chosen him over fortune and fame, who'd declared in the most public way possible that home wasn't about bloodlines or breeding rights. Home was about belonging to each other. The wooden sign swayed gently in the morning breeze, its hand-carved letters catching the early sunlight that painted the Montana mountains in shades of gold and amber. Thomas ran his fingers over the words he couldn't see but knew by heart. Mackenzie Ranch, where broken things find hope. Doc Henderson had helped him carve it during the long winter evenings, and now it hung proudly at the entrance to his property, like a declaration of purpose. 6 months had passed since the courthouse victory, and the Mackenzie Ranch had transformed into something Thomas had never imagined when he'd bought a dying horse for $50. Word of Spirit's story had spread far beyond the county lines, bringing visitors from across the region who wanted to see the miracle horse and the blind cowboy who'd saved him. But more importantly, it had brought other broken things that needed hope. "Easy there, girl," Thomas said softly to the mare in the far corral, his voice carrying the patience that had become his trademark. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." The mare was the 7th rescue horse to arrive at the ranch since spring. She'd been found abandoned on a back road, her ribs showing through a matted coat, her eyes holding the same defeated look that Spirit had worn at the auction. Like all the others, she would need time and patience, and the kind of careful attention that couldn't be rushed. Spirit had become Thomas's partner in the healing process, serving as a calming presence for the frightened animals that arrived at the ranch. The former champion seemed to understand his role as ambassador, approaching each new rescue with gentle curiosity, showing them through his own recovery that trust was possible again. "He's teaching them," Doc Henderson had observed during one of his visits, "teaching them that humans can be kind, that this place is safe. I've never seen anything like it." The ranch's transformation had required help from the community that had rallied around Thomas during the legal battle. Jake Morrison had surprised everyone by withdrawing his offers to purchase the property and instead organizing work crews to repair fences and rebuild the barn. Bill Preston had donated feed and supplies, while Frank Carver had helped establish the non-profit status that allowed the ranch to accept donations and grants. Mary Chen's follow-up articles had attracted attention from animal welfare organizations and private donors who wanted to support the ranch's mission. The legal settlement from the Riverside estate had provided enough funding to establish a modest endowment, ensuring that the Mackenzie Ranch could continue its work regardless of Thomas's personal finances. But the most significant change was in Thomas himself. The bitter isolation that had consumed him since Sarah's death had been replaced by a sense of purpose that got him up before dawn and kept him working until well after sunset. The ranch buzzed with activity, now volunteers who came to help with the horses, visitors who wanted to hear the story, reporters who continued to document the ongoing recoveries. "Thomas," called a familiar voice from the yard. Patricia Wells approached the corral with the confident stride of a woman who'd found her own purpose in the aftermath of their legal victory. She'd taken on several similar cases since then, representing people whose bonds with animals transcended simple ownership concepts. "Morning, Patricia. What brings you out here so early?" "Good news," she replied, the smile evident in her voice. "The state legislature is considering a bill that would recognize animal preference in custody disputes. They're calling it the Thunder's Pride Act." Thomas felt a surge of satisfaction that surprised him with its intensity. The idea that their court battle might help other people in similar situations, that Spirit's choice might establish precedent for future cases, felt like validation of everything they'd endured. "There's something else," Patricia continued. "I've been contacted by a publisher who wants to turn your story into a book. Apparently, there's quite a market for stories about second chances and unexpected friendships." Thomas considered the offer while listening to the sounds of his ranch horses nickering to each other, the splash of water troughs being filled, the distant lowing of cattle that had returned to his pastures as his finances stabilized. The idea of sharing Spirit's story with a wider audience appealed to him, especially if it might help other broken things find their way to hope. "What do you think, boy?" Thomas asked Spirit, who had wandered over to investigate the conversation. "Ready to be famous?" Spirit's response was to nuzzle Thomas's pocket, searching for the sugar cubes that had become part of their morning routine. Some things, Thomas reflected, never changed Spirit's sweet tooth, his habit of leaning into Thomas's touch, his preference for standing close enough that Thomas could always hear his breathing. The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted his thoughts. A pickup truck pulled into the yard, followed by a horse trailer that spoke of another delivery. Thomas had learned to recognize the sound of hope arriving at his ranch, usually in the form of an animal that somebody else had given up on. "That'll be the gelding from Billings," Doc Henderson said, climbing out of his truck with the energy of a man 20 years younger. At 74, the veterinarian had found new purpose in the ranch's mission, making regular visits to monitor the recovery of each rescue horse. The gelding that emerged from the trailer was painfully thin, his coat dull and patchy, his movements tentative and fearful. But Thomas could hear something in the horse's breathing that spoke of potential, the same underlying strength that he'd detected in Spirit all those months ago. "What's his story?" Thomas asked. "Same as always," Doc replied sadly. "Owner died, family couldn't afford upkeep, horse got forgotten in a back pasture until a neighbor called animal control. He's got some medical issues, but nothing that proper care won't fix." Thomas approached the new arrival with the patience that had become his signature, moving slowly enough that the horse could track his movements by sound. When he extended his hand, the gelding flinched away, then gradually allowed the contact. "It's okay, boy," Thomas murmured, the same words he'd spoken to Spirit at the auction so many months ago. "You're safe now. We're going to take good care of you." Behind him, Spirit nickered softly, adding his own reassurance to the welcome. The sound seemed to calm the new arrival, who lifted his head slightly and took his first tentative step toward trust. As the morning progressed, Thomas fell into the familiar rhythm of integrating a new rescue into the ranch's routine. Medical examination, careful introduction to the other horses, establishment of feeding schedules and exercise routines. Each step was guided by the lessons he'd learned with Spirit, refined through experience with the 6 horses who'd followed. By afternoon, the new gelding was settled in a corral next to Spirit's, where the champion could provide companionship without overwhelming the frightened animal. Thomas stood by the fence, listening to the gentle sounds of horses getting acquainted, and felt the deep satisfaction that had become the cornerstone of his new life. "Hard to believe it's been less than a year," Doc Henderson observed, joining Thomas at the fence. "From one dying horse to a full-scale rescue operation, Sarah would be proud." The mention of his wife's name no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. Instead, Thomas felt a warm glow of connection, as if Sarah's spirit lived on in the work they were doing at the ranch. She'd always been the one to bring home strays, to believe that broken things could be healed with enough patience and love. "She always said that helping was its own reward," Thomas replied. "I guess I finally understand what she meant." As evening approached, Thomas made his final rounds of the day, checking on each horse, ensuring that water troughs were full and feed buckets prepared for the morning. The routine had become meditation, a series of actions that centered his thoughts and reminded him of his purpose. Spirit followed him on these evening walks, staying close enough that Thomas could reach out and touch him whenever he needed the reassurance of contact. The bond between them had deepened, rather than diminished, with the addition of other horses to their family. If anything, sharing their healing journey with other broken souls had strengthened their connection. "What do you think, boy?" Thomas asked as they stood together watching the sunset paint the sky in colors he could only remember. "Think we're making a difference?" Spirit's response was to rest his head on Thomas's shoulder, a gesture that had become their private language of affection and understanding. In the distance, the other rescue horses grazed peacefully in their pastures, living proof that second chances were possible, that broken didn't mean worthless. The wooden sign creaked gently in the evening breeze, its message clear to anyone who might be looking for hope in the gathering darkness. The Mackenzie Ranch had become more than a place where animals recovered from neglect and abuse. It had become a testament to the power of believing in broken things, of seeing potential where others saw only problems. Thomas pulled the faded photograph from his shirt pocket, his fingers tracing the familiar edges as he did every evening. Sarah smiled up at him from their wedding day, young and beautiful and full of faith in their future together. He'd kept his promise to her, even if it had taken him years to understand what that promise really meant. "We did it, Sarah," he whispered to the photograph. "We found our way back to hope." As full darkness settled over the Montana landscape, Thomas and Spirit walked slowly back to the house, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a ranch at peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new broken things that needed healing, new opportunities to prove that love and patience could overcome almost any damage. But tonight, there was just the satisfaction of work well done, the comfort of a horse's steady breathing beside him, and the knowledge that sometimes the most broken things teach us the greatest lessons about hope. The Mackenzie Ranch had become exactly what its sign promised, a place where broken things found hope, where second chances became new beginnings, and where a blind cowboy and a champion horse proved that belonging to each other was worth more than all the money in the world.